Good evening, everyone. I will take a long time to say the date because we're starting just a hair early. Now it's 7 o'clock. So today is December 19th. This is the last LaRouche Organization Symposium before Christmas, but not the last before the end of the year. And speaking of Christmas and also Hanukkah, which we are in the midst of, and we're approaching Christmas, unfortunately, things in the Holy Land are not peaceful and serene. It's disappeared somewhat from the media, but I think given that Christ was born in Bethlehem, which is what is now called the West Bank, one ought to mention that while we supposedly have a ceasefire, Israel has been violating it. They have not been allowing adequate supplies into Gaza. They are killing people in the West Bank, and you have horrible winter rainstorms and floods that are affecting 800,000 people who still do not have sufficient food or medical care. So that is something that should be on everyone's mind during this holy day season. Otherwise, let me say, also breaking the non-tranquility in Southwest Asia. The United States launched strikes on Syria today, claiming that this is not to start a new war, it's just an act of vengeance. Well, I've never known vengeance to be terribly productive. I think Martin Luther King spoke strongly against that, as did Christ. But that is what's happened there. So we apparently allegedly bombed some kind of ISIS facility, ISIS resources, whatever. Of course, the president of Syria that was installed in this peculiar coup himself is formerly ISIS. That might be a little bit like being formerly with the CIA or other intelligence agencies. Now, on larger matters, everything looms large. We have the ongoing talks to try and end the Ukraine-Russia war. And I'm wondering if Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are beginning to feel like ping pong balls traipsing back and forth across the Atlantic, and frankly, not doing a terribly good job of holding the line of what a principled solution should be based on the talks between Presidents Putin and Trump in Alaska. Russia has been very consistent about their legitimate security concerns, what they would consider an acceptable end to this. They have not moved the goalpost 1 inch. They've been very clear since the beginning of the launch of the special military operation. The Europeans are very freaked out, and they just ran into some difficulty. They're running out of cash to give Ukraine. They thought they were going to seize the $300 billion of foreign currency reserves, dollars, that Russia had, but the Prime Minister of Belgium and some other European leaders blocked that. Now they don't have that money. They're in a bit of a panic. They're trying to arrange a $100 billion loan. I don't know where they're getting that. In the National Defense Authorization Act, the United States is approving $400 million more to Ukraine. It really should be zero at this point until the conflict is ended and reconstruction and can begin. But I will say 400 million is nothing compared to hundreds of billions of dollars that were going in there sooner. So there's quite a panic in Europe over what appears to be decoupling of the US from NATO. And in fact, the US is NATO. So that's a big problem. And then we have the possibility of whether we're going to have a war with Venezuela. Happily, 2 nights ago, when President Trump gave his 9 p.m. address, many people thought that he was going to announce the beginning of war with Venezuela. Happily, he did not. There is substantial opposition in the Congress. Also, Tucker Carlson made a kind of emergency appearance on Judge Napolitano's program, where they both spoke very forcefully against this. Maybe it is the case that President Trump and others in his administration are realizing that Venezuela is larger than Panama and Iraq, that things are not going to go very well, and it frankly would be a total unmitigated disaster if we were to start this war, not to mention that it would be illegal. So that's not clear. What's driving all of this is the end of colonialism and the breakdown of the transatlantic financial system. And we really have at hand the opportunity for a new paradigm and a new strategic architecture, but the United States has to come to its senses. Now, given all of the uproar in Europe and from the neocons in the United States over NATO, I wanted to invite two of my associates, Rich Freeman and Bill Jones, who have been longtime associates of LaRouche, researchers and writers for Executive Intelligence Review and other publications. And I think we're going to get right into it with Rich Freeman, who will be the first to speak, followed by Bill Jones, and then a dialogue and also Q&A. So if you have questions, please, you may go ahead and post them in the chat. I have to tell you that I know there's a message that says questions at laroucheorganization.com, but I actually don't have access to that email. So if you want your question answered, please put it in the chat on Facebook, X, or YouTube. So with that, please go ahead, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Diane. And I think one thing I'd just like to say at the outset, because Diane has already written this into the description of what this program would be tonight, is that Helga Zepp LaRouche put out the statement, withdrawal from NATO, which is on the Schiller Institute website. And I would say at the very beginning, by the end of this, every single person who's watching should sign it. And if they have other people they know, they should sign it too. So what we're going to look at is what the origins of NATO are and what NATO is doing that requires its dissolution. And Bill and I were speaking the other night as to even the necessity of NATO formation in the first place, which Bill will be addressing. What I'd like to do is to talk about something that a few people know about, but they really don't know the full picture of it. And that's a program that was run back in 1945. It was put together by, it's called Operation Unthinkable. And I'm going to say that this is the major intent of the formation of NATO. There are other forces that were involved. There are other viewpoints that were put into it. But as you'll see, this is, I think, the leading edge of what NATO has been doing for its entire existence. The Operation Unthinkable was conceived by Prime Minister Churchill. It was presented by a final report in May 22nd, 1945, but one historian said that would have taken about 5 weeks to work out. So, and it was done on a crash basis. So this would have been ordered in April of 1945. So if we could have some of the slides, please, Diane, if you could give me access to that. Okay. So what I'd like to do is just start with, this is Operation Unthinkable, the Anglo-American NATO plan to dismember Russia. And this is something Lyndon LaRouche said. A previous show we used, we reported this, but I think it's extremely important. He said, April 12th, 1945 is the date of the untimely death of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt. As it turned out, his death changed the course of world history very much for the worse. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and what Churchill represented took over. Most of the hellish moments through which the world has lived since that date are the rotten fruit of Churchill's untimely political victory over his political opponent, Roosevelt. Now, this is the cover page of Operation Unthinkable, which I obtained from the library, the National Archives of Great Britain. And you'll see written in handwriting, I hope you can make it out, but if not, I'll read it for you. It says, Russia, threat to Western civilization. So that's the viewpoint that was in Operation Unthinkable. That is the viewpoint of NATO. You can say a lot of things about defensive alliance. There may have been reasons for certain features, but that's the viewpoint that they have, threat to Western civilization. So this is what it looks like. It's a page that I copied from the archive page. No one will be able to read that. So what I did is I just simply transcribed a few points. I simply wrote out the pages, but all they will be is what you can see at the very top, joint planning staff, where you may be able to make that out. So here's the point of Operation Unthinkable. This is strictly what the document says. It's just written so people can read it by myself. Operation Unthinkable, report by the Joint Planning Staff. We've examined Operation Unthinkable. As instructed, we have taken the following assumptions on which to base our examination. And this then says that they want the full assistance not only of Polish armed forces, but also German manpower, which means they'd be deploying German POWs, which is against the 1927, I believe, Geneva Convention. I mean, it's just not allowed. They didn't care about that. What they say, and this is the object, they have different sections of the report which have different headlines. The overall or political object is to impose upon Russia the will of the United States and British Empire. I just want to say one thing. This was done in total secrecy. It was done by 4 people who were the head of what they call the Committee of Staff, Chiefs of Staff Committee, which are the head of the Air Force, Navy, and the Army, and also one other person who we'll introduce in a second. So the United States is being assigned this role by Churchill. They know nothing about this. No one in the British government knows anything. Eisenhower doesn't know about it. No one in the United States knows about it. But this is the way they're proceeding. The only way, you can see point 3, in which we can achieve our objective with certainty and lasting results is by victory in a total war. And I'll say what that is in a second. And then this one is really revealing. Total war, so now let's explain. But watch what the first point number 4 says. Apart from the chances of revolution in the USSR and the political collapse of the present regime, on which we are not competent to express an opinion. They're not going to assume that. The elimination of Russia could only be achieved as a result of everything else that follows is the elimination of Russia. That's what they're talking about, not simply military victories, the elimination of Russia. Now, let me give you a couple more quotes and then we can discuss this. There's virtually no limit to the distance to which it will be necessary for the Allies to penetrate Russia in order to render it fully resistance impossible. So, therefore, next one. To achieve the decisive defeat of Russia in a total war would require the deployment in Europe of a large proportion of the resources of the United States. And they go for it. Now, what's a total war? They say it. A total war means you're not just having, this was a huge deployment. It had over air wing of over 10,000 aircraft, bombers, strategic bombers, fighter jets, and so forth. But what it meant was that they were going to have all over Russia. It would spread, they say later in the report, to Asia. It could last several years. So what is meant by total war in this report is what we call today, or various people call today, permanent war, endless war. That's what they're talking about in Operation Unthinkable, a total endless war. And what they're going to do is they're going to start first by attacking the Russian troops which were in Poland and Germany. Now, remember, this was commissioned in April 12th, 1945. The victory in Europe occurs on May 8th or 9th. May 8th is celebrated in the West. May 9th, it occurred on May 9th in Russia. So that's why it's those 2 dates. So this is before the war has ended in Europe. And they're already talking about starting World War III. So the idea is that the reason that Russian troops are in Germany is they're overrunning the fierce resistance of the in the rear guard of the Nazis. They're trying to overthrow the Nazis. We haven't ended the war. There's a pincers movement with the Russians coming from the east and the Americans coming from the west. And of course, the whole battle of the Ardennes, which was the Battle of the Bulge, which occurred in January, February of that year, had already been decisive in one way. But this is still going on. So the Russians will know nothing about that. It's unthinkable. So let me just say 2 other things about what the plan is. The plan is they will go in and they will conquer entire portions of land. At a certain point, if the Russians don't submit, meaning capitulate, then they will run over the military, the war production facilities, which means they will take over all the industrial operations in Russia. They will then subjugate the population, and they will then chop Russia up into pieces. And it will no longer exist as a sovereign state. That's the objectives. Those are in the report of Operation Unthinkable. Now, these are the people who are running this thing. So the first one is Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the British Imperial Staff. That means he's the head of the army. Sir Andrew Cunningham, First Sea Lord. He's the head of the Navy. Sir Douglas Eville, and he's the head of the Air Force. And here's the last person, because he's extremely important. Sir Hastings Ismay. Sir Hastings Ismay was the Chief of Staff to Winston Churchill from actually 1940 through 46. I put through 45. So when this task force is set up, strictly secret, he is assigned as the secretary to this by Churchill. So Churchill's military adjutant is now the secretary of the Joint Chiefs of Staff operation. He works on this entire plan. In 1951, when the NATO decides, it was created in 1949, but in 1951, when they appoint the first secretary of NATO, it is Sir Hastings Ismay. And he knows a lot about Operation Unthinkable since he was in the middle of it. That's who started to set the doctrine, which was then spread out through a number of institutions and other types of things. Now, I just want to show you one other person. This is a person who actually helped write the NATO stuff. He's a British Foreign Minister, Ernest Bevin, and he was in there from 1945 through 51 under Clement Attlee. The point about Bevin was that he served in the Churchill government from 1940 through 45 as the Minister of Labor, effectively. They had a longer title than that. And he took some of Churchill's ideas when he created NATO. He's also famous for this statement, which was that we will keep the Germans down, we will keep the Russians out, and we'll keep the Americans in. That's his statement. And we can go into that, but I'm not going to go into it now. So where does this come from? Why is this so critical? Well, the reason it's so critical is that this was an ongoing outlook among the British. During the Crimean War, which is the 1850s, I just put this here because London and Crimea, you can see, I put 2,000 miles apart. What is London doing in Crimea? Well, what they were doing was they go to Crimea, which is part of Russia, and they go and lay siege to Sevastopol. And they and the French do 11-month siege to make the Russians surrender parts of what they were holding at that time. So the British interest in crushing the Russians goes back a long way. This map, which I won't go into now, but if there's questions, we can. 1918, 1919, the Russian Revolution is 1917. And what happens is, under the guise of this, Churchill, who's appointed the head of the defense forces, his office of Secretary of Defense, it wasn't called Secretary of Defense, I don't have the exact title, but it is that. He is waging a war. He sends in 100,000 troops, which some of them are American, but mostly they're British, they're French, they're White Russians, and so forth. And I just want to emphasize to you, if you can see, you'll see on the left, Galicians, Poles, Germans. You'll see on the right, Siberia. These were encircling all of Russia. Wilson did not approve of it from the United States. And even the Lloyd George, who was the head of the British, did not approve of it. But Churchill moved around them and was trying to crush Russia even then. So this goes very deeply into his outlook. Now, just a few other points. So that's the plan. It's quite a plan. It's not a plan just to push back the Russians from the borders of where they are in Poland and Romania and so forth. It's a plan to eliminate Russia. The last thing I want to just say on this point, and then two other points that will give you a fuller sense. What happened was that on July 16th, as many people probably know, 1945, Operation Trinity was put into effect in Alamogordo, New Mexico, which are the white sands of Alamogordo, where a bomb, the first bomb, nuclear atomic bomb, was detonated. This was run by the Manhattan Project. And it lit up the morning sky. It was around 5 a.m. when it went off. And what happened was, on the 17th of that month, which is the next day, July 17th, 1945, Truman informs that Churchill that it has been a success. And then what happens next is that Churchill now goes to Sir Alan Brooke. He's the chief of the British Imperial Staff, and that means he's the head of the army. And this is what Brooke puts into his diary for July 23rd, 1945. Churchill had absorbed all the minor American exaggerations, and as a result, was completely carried away. It was now no longer necessary for the Russians to come into the Japanese war. The new explosive alone was sufficient to settle the matter. Furthermore, and this is now he's referring to what Churchill is telling Alan Brooke. Churchill cornered Alan Brooke to tell him he's in a completely manic state. Furthermore, we now have something in our hands which would redress the balance with Russians. Now we could say to Stalin, if you insist on doing this or that, well, we can just blot out Moscow, then Stalingrad, then Kiev, then Kuibyshchev, then Kharkov, Sevastopol, and now where are the Russians? Churchill is the first person to call for the nuclear destruction of Russia, even before his evil colleague, Sir Bertrand Russell. And one other thing on this. And this is just Alan Brooke talking about how Churchill appreciated the atomic bomb. He reflects it. I mean, he's stunned when it first said to him, but then he reflects afterwards and tries to say, gee, what a wonderful picture of himself. This is just the last sentence I want to point everyone to. He at once painted a wonderful picture of himself as the sole possessor of these bombs and capable of dumping them where he wished, thus all-powerful and capable of dictating. Now, the thing you have to realize, which I won't go into here, is that by the Quebec Agreement of 1943, the British had co-deployment rights over the nuclear bomb, including the one in Japan. And in fact, it was Churchill, when they had committee meetings, who pushed for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he was probably the most effective person in doing it. Most of the American military generals, MacArthur, Nimitz, Eisenhower, opposed the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Churchill was for it. But this is what he now sees himself as the sole possessor of these bombs. And later he says to his Lord Moran, who was his surgeon, his doctor, but also his accomplice, is a confidant. America knows that 52% of Russia's motor industry is in Moscow and could be wiped out by a single bomb. It might mean wiping out 3 million people. And this is the point I want to get at, because people say, how can the people in Europe be so insane that they know they're going to kill more Ukrainians, possibly part of their own population? Look at this sentence. This is genocide. Churchill knew the Russians had no way of defending themselves against a nuclear bomb. And he's going to wipe out 3 million people in just Moscow alone? This is bestiality. This is the origin of what NATO does. Not everything, but this is the way they think. And it was put in by Churchill. The last things I want to do, there's many things about this. Churchill kept up this question of trying to get Truman to drop the bombs on Russia. You can see if an atomic bomb could be dropped on the Kremlin, this is from 1947. He kept this up into the 1950s. But what I want to get to at the end, just to give you a further sense of this. And by the way, one thing, this is just to throw this out. The World War II, forget the history books. It was to wipe out Russia and Germany. This is a quote from historian Max Hastings. This is very good. He's a British historian. And it says, John Moore Brabazon, Minister of Aircraft Production, was rash enough to publicly state his hope that the Russians and Germans would exterminate each other. That's World War I. The last thing I just want to do is just give you some quotes of, this is from Churchill, and it gives you a sense of the mindset of a psychotic, a real psychotic, a bestial psychotic. These are from letters he wrote. This first one is a letter that he wrote to a friend in 1897. And he's talking about what they're doing in the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. After today, we began to burn villages, every one, and all who resist will be killed without quarter. The Mohammeds need a lesson that there is no doubt that we are a very cruel people. And then this is in his some from his volume, My Early Life. And he said, we proceeded systematically, village by village. This is a different quote, different time, but it tells you what he was doing. And we destroyed the houses, filled up the wells, blew down the towers, cut down the great shady trees, burned the crops, and broke the reservoirs in punitive devastation. The last thing I just want to go into, he's a strong supporter of Mussolini and Franco. Open. It's almost never put into his biographies or put in like a small little section. The key thing is that when Mussolini was having trouble, and Italy owed $600 million. At that point, Churchill was the Chancellor of the Exchequer of Britain. That means the Treasurer. And what he did is he agreed to defer payments until 1930 and then until 1988. So he was keeping Mussolini in power. He had these statements about Franco. He has horrible things about Gandhi. But the last thing is his praise for Hitler. Quote, one may dislike Hitler's system and yet admire his patriotic achievement. If our country were defeated, I hope we could find a champion as indomitable to restore our courage and lead us back to our place among the nations. I have on more than one occasion made my appeal in public that the Führer of Germany should now become the Hitler of peace. So that's the thing. The last thing I'll say, but which we can take from the question period, because I want to make sure Bill has time, is that the Iron Curtain speech has almost nothing to do with what you think it is. And what it really is to reverse the picture. Yes, there were troubles with the Russians, but what actually is he's declaring the Cold War so that everyone is made to appear as an enemy, like the Thomas Hobbes war of all against all. And what he says openly is that the United States, whom he hated, will be brought into the British Commonwealth, sharing planes, sharing military, and possibly, as he says in this speech, people generally read one or two paragraphs, that they will have joint citizenship. That is the reabsorption into the British Empire. So there's a lot more that can be said. I am not saying this is the only thing that was said, but through the Cold War, the world was broken into two. People couldn't cooperate, East and West, on great projects, on culture, and so forth. All of those things were eliminated. The South couldn't work with the North under these circumstances. And any time you could have a crisis, so that the world was kept under the sword of Damocles, that at any time there could be a nuclear war or anything like that. And even after the Cold War technically so-called ended in 1991, that was the same process. Bring back the British Empire, destroy these things. This is why we have to end NATO.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to bring up Bill Jones, who will continue this story and then some, and then we'll open for discussion. So Bill, please go ahead.
Thank you, Diane. Before going into the origin of NATO, I'd like to point up just as an appendix to what Richie said on Unthinkable, is that there were a number of other operations that were carried out there, or that were designed during the Cold War, which people know about now, not as broadly as they should, but that was brought up in the Russian context. The Russians, of course, about a month or so ago, they had video on Operation Unthinkable because of the importance of that, and to inform their own population on things that had been done to Russia and were in the process of being done by certain forces here in the West today. But since then, the head of the FSB, the internal security forces in Russia, Sergei Naryshkin, is also the head of the Russian Historical Society. So he gave out a few documents, not only on unthinkable, but he also pointed to a number of other so-called operations. Operation Charioteer in 1948, which would drop 135 atomic bombs on 70 Soviet cities. Various other operations, Fleetwood, Bushwhacker, Trojan, Broadview in 1946, focused on defense of North America against potential Soviet airstrikes and sabotage. And then there were other plans that were there. None of those really went into operation, thankfully. But that was the general climate in those days. And the reason they didn't go into operation more than anything else was thanks to the American presidency. And I think this is a lesson that is also of importance today in the light of the crisis that is now ongoing in Europe, hopefully leading to a peaceful solution, but a very dicey situation because many of the ideas that were prevalent during this early period of the Cold War have now again been brought to the fore by certain European leaders who have much of the same outlook that Churchill and others had at that time. You also have to understand the axiom that when you find these craziness going on, you have to follow the line that it's the British stupid. You know, even certain things that happen here in the United States are more a result of British influence in the United States than anything else. But with regard to the origins of NATO, during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt succeeded in achieving a working relationship with Joseph Stalin. Roosevelt, of course, had some goodwill with the Soviet Union because in 1933, he reestablished relations with that new Union of Soviet Republics. And during the war, of course, he understood the tremendous importance of the Soviet forces. It was the largest military force in the world as it was built up, which would have to move against the German armies in order to have any possibility of the Allies getting their act together and returning to the European continent. And so that was an important relationship for him, which he hoped to continue in the post-war period. Now, as the war progressed, of course, there were agreements. Russia was coming from the east, and after the landing of Normandy, the Allied forces were moving from the west and also from the south, having gone into Italy, and they came to an agreement on where they would meet. And this was very important because you might have a situation in which one of the forces that in terms of what the Soviets would want to do would not be in the interest of the Allies. So you had a certain meeting point. The real first point was on the Elbe, which is celebrated every year by the U.S. and by Russia. But there was an agreement on where they would meet and how far they would go. After that, of course, there were continued discussions. Eisenhower, after the war, spent time in Moscow talking with the head of the Soviet forces, Marshal Zhukov, with whom he became very friendly. And things went well until Truman, under pressure from Churchill and from others in the United States, dropped the bomb as a means of ending the war in Japan, but primarily as a means of sending a signal to the Soviet Union that if they did not agree to what the Allies were talking about, they also could be targets of this new and a horrible weapon. At that point, Eisenhower actually was in Moscow at that time, and he indicated that the climate all of a sudden became very dark. And he was extremely upset about that, and it had a very disturbing effect in the relationship that he was having even with Marshal Zhukov. So you had after the war increasing tensions between the Soviets and the Allies. The death of Franklin Roosevelt sent a signal to Stalin that he no longer had someone that he, in some sense, could trust on the other side of that divide, and so that his stance tended to harden. He actually sent messages. He felt that Roosevelt had been assassinated, and he even sent messages to the United States to the effect that this should be investigated. So he was very upset about that, and became much more steely in his demands, feeling that there was no longer that rapport that he had previously had with the Western powers. The talks continued, however, until I believe 1948 was the last one, not with Stalin directly, but with Foreign Minister Molotov. Truman had met with Molotov in Washington and was very brusque with him, creating a very bad feeling on the Russian side of who this new president, whom they knew very little about, but whom they knew was the one that was responsible for dropping the atomic bomb. And that, of course, didn't help matters at all. So that at the last meeting between the Allies and and Molotov in London, Bevan, who was the British negotiator, began to talk with George Marshall, indicating that they ought to do something to increase the defensive capabilities in Europe, given the fact that they could not get an agreement with the Soviets on any of the really tricky questions. The tricky questions were obviously Poland was one, Czechoslovakia, which had been relatively independent. There was a tightening. There were Soviet troops there, and there was a tightening in the administration of Czechoslovakia, and Germany was still divided. And the idea was that it should be unified, but it was half occupied by Western forces and half occupied by Soviet forces. And the question was that if we cannot have discussions on this, then we should be concerned about our defense posture. The Soviets had the biggest army in the world. They had 3 times as many ground troops on the European continent in Eastern Europe than the Allies, that is the French, the British, and the United States combined had in the West. So that Bevan said to Marshall that we must have some kind of defense cooperation to make sure that at least we can defend ourselves if the Soviets decided to move further than we have hitherto agreed upon. Marshall was aware of this. Marshall was a person who I think also understood the British problem to some extent. When Churchill first came to Washington in 1941, shortly after Pearl Harbor for the first meetings with Roosevelt, Marshall was one of the people who told Harry Hopkins that he was concerned that Roosevelt would sell the store to Churchill and that we would go in hock to the British. And that, of course, didn't happen. But there was this realization generally in the U.S. elites about this British problem. So that NATO was created as an alliance between these forces simply in order to have enough forces on the ground to negotiate with the Soviets and not fearing that that any of the Western countries would be overrun. It's not clear that Stalin would want to do that. What happened in Eastern Europe, of course, was something of creating a buffer to the West. the threat to the Soviet Union had come from Germany, and had also been manipulated by the British, who for 2 centuries had been considered the chief strategic enemy of Russia on the continent, and that therefore he wanted that buffer to make sure that the Soviet Union would not again be surprised. And of course, the fact that the U.S. was inclined to bring Germany into some kind of a defensive alliance and not treat them as simply as a war criminal, because the entire country was not a war criminal. And there were people who were working against Hitler and people who were in favor of recreating Germany on the classical terms and eliminating the Nazi threat. That they should also be recognized. That was the U.S. position. But of course, the Russians were not really favorable to that, and that sent a bad signal to them as well. So you had this ironic situation that Richie talked about, where there was not complete, confinement between East and West, but that there was little relationships in many of these areas, including economic, social, and cultural. And it took quite some time for those to be rebuilt. And that NATO served essentially as a forum for defensive operations, as long as there was a president in the White House who understood the importance of maintaining a relationship with the Soviet Union. This was not a problem. During the Truman administration, of course, you had someone who was really bowled over by Winston Churchill, the haberdasher from Missouri, who didn't make it good, unfortunately, selling ties and suits to Missouri businessmen, had to find another job. And he was taken up by the Pendergrass mob in Kansas City that really had the political muscle there, and was brought into politics as a result. But he was certainly not the man for the job. And most of what he did exacerbated the entire situation with regard to the Soviet Union. It was another case with President Eisenhower, who was, of course, aware not only of the Soviet Union, but also aware of the British problem. And of course, this was seen in 1956 in the action he took in the Suez. But it was also quite clear to him, knowing something about Russia through his relationship in particular with Marshal Zhukov, that he made an attempt to try and create some kind of a rapport with the Soviet Union. And this was after 1953, when he was president. With the death of Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev came to power, and he made the attempt, Eisenhower made the attempt to have a summit meeting with him to try and discuss the situation in order to ease the tensions between East and West. And as people might remember or might know, the U-2 affair kind of blew a hole in that meeting, and that didn't succeed. Nevertheless, Eisenhower was quite inclined to try and create some kind of relationship with the Soviet Union in many respects. His Atoms for Peace program was an attempt to transform nuclear weapons, which at that point both the West and the Soviets had, in order to bring that into peaceful channels. There was problems, of course, and then with Kennedy, of course, that was followed up by his attempt to actually end the Cold War, as was indicated in his speech at American University. We had problems when Jimmy Carter came to power. Nixon was also tried to have an agreement, and did indeed bring about agreements with Brezhnev, and the Apollo-Soyuz program was the first major scientific cooperation in space between those two countries, and that was a result of Nixon. So that all of these crazy schemes that were being perpetrated in Britain and other places within NATO, and even in the United States, in terms of attacks on the Soviet Union, that they existed and they were proliferated, but it was also always stopped at the top by the President of the United States. The only time that it became very problematic, if I can recall, was during the Carter years, when many of these various operations that were being conducted in NATO, and I think particularly of Operation Helix, which seemed to be not only a maneuver, but also an attempt to create an incident leading to war by NATO, were stopped largely by the fact that there was another person on the scene named Lyndon LaRouche, who was no president, who had no official position, but who had a movement that could create an understanding among the American population and among the Europeans about what was happening with these crazy things that were going on there. LaRouche was also instrumental in the one major peace proposal made by Ronald Reagan, the Strategic Defense Initiative, in which Reagan actually proposed to share technologies with the Soviet Union to develop defense capabilities based on laser and exotic weapons that could destroy missiles in flight, making them thus obsolete. And this also, of course, was the major effort by LaRouche, which succeeded in convincing the president that this should happen. And as a result of many of our enemies, including our British friends, the so-called special relationship made an effort to eliminate the power and the influence of LaRouche on the U.S. presidency. And it was made clear to him by a major figure in the British oligarchy, a nobleman by the name of de Courcy, who was very high level in British intelligence during the time that these so-called legal operations conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation that we know so well, also from the Russiagate and other operations, that he said quite openly to our representatives that if LaRouche would quit attacking the British and attacking the special relationship, he could find a fine place. All these operations would come to an end, and he could find a place in the bureaucracy where he could advise the president. LaRouche, of course, was uncompromising on the issue of the British problem, because that was for him the basic problem. This also happened during the Clinton era, when LaRouche got out of prison and immediately became a track to Russia by the Clinton administration to try and find him. This was after the fall of the Soviet Union, a fall that was largely a result of the fact that they never accepted Reagan's proposal. And it was a new situation. There was a new president there, Yeltsin. The Clinton administration didn't know exactly what to do, but President Clinton had a certain understanding of the importance of LaRouche. He actually read LaRouche's material. He was very fascinated by it. People don't know that, but it was the fact. And LaRouche went after getting a parole in 1994, he was sent to the Soviet Union largely as a two-track to get a reading of the situation of what was happening in Russia. And he came back and he gave his advice to Clinton, much of which Clinton was favorable towards. There was also renewal for a time of the kind of an SDI sort of thing, where the Russians then made a proposal that we should cooperate on a global defense initiative. Clinton was in favor of that. What happened, however, is that although he was smart enough to realize that what LaRouche was saying was absolutely on the mark, he was very weak politically. And unfortunately, he assigned at a certain point Al Gore, who was a total opponent of everything that LaRouche stood for, as the point person for Russia. So that what happened during the Yeltsin era, unfortunately, destroyed the growing influence of the United States that one could clearly see in Russia in 1994 that was all destroyed by the 10 years of so-called Wild West capitalism, which was introduced into Russia, which didn't stop until Putin came to power. So that's the history of this thing, and that's the problem with NATO. I want to emphasize this role of the president, because NATO should be dissolved, as Helga has said, but it has to be done on the basis of what she has said of creating a new security architecture, because it's not simply a question that the United States would leave NATO and that the Europeans on their own would try and pull together something that they can do, because that could very well, under present conditions, lead to war. And the problem that we're facing now is a little different than we were facing when NATO was formed. Because when NATO was formed, we were looking at, okay, you have these European nations and you have a 3 times stronger Soviet army on the border. How do we balance that out? At this point, what we have is we have a new relationship with Russia, and we're creating a new capabilities there. But you can't let the Europeans be on their own, because they will sabotage it, because the British role will then become the dominant role among, they might not call it NATO, they may call it the European Union defense operation, but it will have the same psychology that we're seeing today among these leaders. So that what has to be done is not simply NATO has to be dissolved, but you have to have a new security architecture that's going to include Russia, China, and other countries, so that you have what the Russians are calling in their own way an indivisible security. That is, that all parties feel themselves secure, and not simply security for one party alone. And this would, of course, also adhere the call for the new security architecture in Helga's appeal is also reflected in the global security initiative that President Xi has put forward. So you have the possibility of using this new alliance, you want to call it that, between the US, Russia, China, and India, even in that respect, to try and see to it that you can bring stability to these wild European leaders who are going off half-cocked, without any reason. But that has to be resolved. That issue has to be taken up, and that requires hands-on development, and not simply the United States pulling back and saying, okay, we'll let it go to hell in a handbasket, because then it could be the danger of war would be on us again.
Great. Thank you very much. Oh dear, we're getting an echo somehow. There we go, Rich Freeman. And I wanted to just show this map so people are clear, because it wasn't as if NATO was founded and then it's still been there and not expanded. That what's happened since 1949, I'm just going to quickly go through this map in terms of NATO, which is the bright green there. So you see Norway, France, the UK, Portugal, Italy, and then look at this, right? Turkey, or now Turkey, Greece, all these nations adding. This is in 1990. This is after the Berlin Wall came down, and we promised NATO won't expand 1 inch, I guess, from this point. And then it expands again. And then you have people insanely proposing that Ukraine should join NATO, etc., and more, even expansion. So this is not Russia or China or Venezuela or Iran surrounding the free world of the United States and Western Europe, but a policy a reverse policy. And I will also venture to say that it has not made us more secure. And not only that, there are places like Libya, which I believe the bombing deployment, the humanitarian bombs that we dropped on Libya, which Hillary Clinton was so happy about, was also a NATO deployment. So this thing has really become quite a mess. I mean, it really seems to have nothing to do with anything that anyone said, but has become more like a kind of an arm of the British Empire or this billionaire globalist elite. So,
Yeah, I would agree, Diane. If I could say two things.
yeah.
First, I do think Roosevelt's death is critical because what Roosevelt was going to do was develop Russia, and the British knew that. Roosevelt was planning to develop the whole world. He was going to take down British imperialism. He said it to Churchill the first time they met off the coast of Canada, Argentia Bay. And that's what he intended to do. And Churchill knew that. The British Empire was declining. They were looting India. There was a famine in 1943, which was created by the British. Churchill would not let people put that famine out, and 1 to 3 million people died, most likely 3 million. But I think this, you can never locate a policy like even Operation Unthinkable unto itself. It always has to be seen what the world was going to do. This was a time in World War II where the greatest change in the world could have taken place, would have taken place. And you would have swept some of the imperialism and the colonialism off the map. And you would have put together one of the things that Churchill wanted. Roosevelt, we had made a $10 billion, not counting the money they paid back. Let's count that money, $9.5 billion to lend lease to Russia. And then Roosevelt had a $10 billion loan for Russia, which was intended to allow them to buy machine tools. I have all the documentation. Put that in today's money, that's a $220 billion loan. That's very, very, very big money. They were planning to do the same thing for China. But I think the question, to take it from a slightly different point, and this is, I think, the way to look at it, and to take it from the way that Helga did it. NATO, the minute the wall came down, and then Russia fell as the Soviet Union fell in late 1991, NATO should have been abolished. And I don't think some of the people did such a great job. I mean, Clinton went to Russia to campaign. It was called a visit, but the campaign for Yeltsin. And Yeltsin was being supported by a dirty fund that was put together by Boris Berezovsky. But there was no reason for NATO. And Helga has said that. And Lynn has said that.
Well, on that, I just want to bring up, because President Putin, and the very long interview he did with Tucker Carlson, I think that's where he said he had spoken with Clinton about Russia joining NATO, and that Clinton seemed to have been open to the idea, but went back and talked to who knows whom. And
yeah, this is what I was saying.
Right, Bill.
All from this whole period forward, and the expansion, there were 12 members of NATO at the beginning, and the problems in Europe defense were solved. In other words, and the Warsaw Pact had dissolved also. So there was no longer a threat of Russian invasion. People knew that. In fact, the United States went in and was destroying Russia through a genocide policy. And so from that point, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic joined in 1999, just picking up what you showed. Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania in 2004. There was no reason for them to join. It should have been shut down. And I do agree with Bill that you would have an alternative policy, which was already the Lambridge policy. And we also had a policy for how to put together a international development bank. That was the context. You could just do it. And what I would say now is not only should the United States pull out, but we should get several other countries to pull out, collapse it from within, and put together Helga's alternative proposal based on the 10 principles, put together what Lynn was talking about an international development bank. It serves no purpose. We don't have to wait. We don't have to see it. It should have been eliminated 30 years ago when the Warsaw Pact collapsed and so forth. And all it has done is consolidated the hardest point, if the Europeans are going to act crazy, and the last thing I just say to you, Bill, if the Europeans are going to act crazy, they're going to act crazy regardless. But if you take out NATO and you dissolve it, they have a harder chance. They could still do it through the EU. But you're making a point to the world, which is why Helga has said, pull out of NATO, not just ourselves, but others, and put into place a world development perspective, which is already being evolved from the BRICS and from the SCO and so forth, and has the feet to make itself change if the United States would itself shift in that direction. It would also pull the plug on a lot of the Europeans.
Okay,
let me just add a couple of things. The reason, the idea of what the problem with the Clinton administration is that he didn't take Lynn's advice, and he shifted towards what Gore was doing. It was not only.
I just want to say he was impeached. I mean, there was a deployment of Monica Lewinsky to ensure
that also, British operations are always of the same nature. Right? But the fact that had changed, that was the major problem you had, because even the Germans were in favor. When Germany was reunited, there was a general move by even people like Alan Barr, who wasn't the best of people, calling for a dissolving NATO, and it was generally understood and discussed widely in Washington at that time on how we could do that. You had Alexander Lebed, who came over here, was a presidential candidate at one point, talking about dissolving NATO, and he was well received. But there was, again, the same problem that you see today, that the British infiltration of the U.S. Establishment has created a policy that is no longer in the American interest. And I think it's important, and I think this is absolutely the case, that this notion of a new security architecture, which has been said by Helgen, which was talked about by Lynn, has always been on the forefront of what Russia has been saying, that they would like peace, but they want peace in which their security is also taken into consideration. And this cannot be done unless there is a new security architecture where all of the parties realize what they can and cannot do. And I think the problem that we're facing here is at least judging from the statements of President Trump, that if the Europeans don't go along, then he'll just back out. NATO may fall apart, but you still got a problem, and it's still a problem that's going to be faced by the Russians. We see that in Zelensky's press conference with the Polish president, who's been very angry with the Ukrainians for a long time. All of a sudden, he meets with him, and he's going to sell them MiG-25s and things like that. That will happen. I mean, that's a situation that you've got to ultimately resolve. And the fact that there is a group of nations now, including Russia, including China, who are pushing that, gives the capability of actually doing this, because the only ones who would be opposed to that, it would be probably just a couple, 2 or 3 now, judging from the vote today, 2 or 3 European nations who would be opposed to that. And you simply have to use the pressure of that, what exists, including the pressure that can be exerted by the President of the United States, to simply put his foot down and say, stop the crap, and we'll move forward on this. And I think that's absolutely necessary in doing this.
If I could just throw in one other thing, Diane and Bill, I think if the U.S. pulls out of NATO, as Helga is saying, pull out, other countries could. Hungary's a member of NATO, and we don't know how the elections are going to go, but they could make a move to pull out of NATO. There are other countries. I think if that happens, that will accelerate, not slow down, the disintegration of what the British can do. This is an institution. One thing that Helga said.
I just want to tell you, we have someone watching us on YouTube who doesn't like this. saying NATO should have been shut down is a good example of how confused and delusional Americans actually are. And they assert that NATO is not going anywhere. I think they do protest a bit much, but
Yes.
yeah.
Okay. Well, that's good. We're reaching somebody. We're striking a chord. That's always a good sign, isn't it? But when Helga says at the end, I think this gets at it because we have to change how people think, and that's what the new security and development architecture does. We have to change their thinking, and this is a way of getting that done. Just if the next to last paragraph she says in this withdraw from NATO, and I imagine the person who wrote in will not sign our memorandum, but I really do think a lot of people.
Someone else did as they were watching. They also
great, and I would say everyone who's watching, sign this and
yes.
think of people you can get. But she says we have reached the point in the universal history of mankind where we must leave behind not only half a millennium of colonialism, but also the mindset that led to 2 world wars in the 20th century, geopolitics. We must leave behind once and for all the barbaric idea that we always need an enemy, that man is wolf to man, as Thomas Hobbes, the ideologist of the British Empire, believed. The barbaric view of humanity is expressed in NATO's promotional video, From Foresight to Warfight. I guess you showed it, but people can go to Helga's statement and they could watch this thing. This was just produced recently, and it's insane. She quotes in saying that war will always be essential human endeavor. That's what this campaign will allow us to do, is to change the idea of man, that man always has to have an enemy, and we can go back to an idea which we had at the beginning of the American Revolution. It wasn't called this, that we're one humanity. The way I say it is because the American Revolution believed that as a temple on the hill, we were going to spread that conception. We have to get back to the concept of one humanity, and you force it by pulling the plug. I don't know, Bill, I don't know what's going to happen with these. I mean, I don't know what Merz is going to do, Macron, but the thing is, it'll put the whole situation into a collapse phase, just as the plug's being pulled partly on Zelensky right now. And if we move with the Russians together, and I don't know what President Trump is going to do or not going to do, if we move, then the reality can be that we can move towards a security and development architecture, which I totally agree with you. That's the essence of it. Get the mindset to change, bring people through this, but you need some forcing mechanisms. And the idea that something that shouldn't have been around, I think, for 35 years, since 1991, 34 years, that will be a trigger. I think we all agree on the principles, but I'm saying we need that as a principle. And Xi Jinping, with his global governance initiative, could move into this vacuum. And Putin has his view of the Eurasian security. In other words, those ideas will come forward. They're going to come forward anyway, but I think they would be even more natural in that environment. And perhaps we could get the American president to think in those terms, through the Bering Strait type of approach.
Bill?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, there is a movement in that direction now. Everybody is talking about it. And I think the efforts of the United States would actually lead to a situation in which you might even have changes in government as a result of the change in that situation, that if the U.S. and Russia could do as they're beginning to do now in creating the kind of relationships that exist economically, socially, culturally, it's going to be very hard for the Europeans to remain isolated. I mean, even in terms of their energy production, what are they going to do? They were going to get energy from the United States, but now the United States is going to cooperate with Russia on this. That would certainly lead them in a direction which they really have to change their policy. It's the big guys on the block. If they come together, it's the little twerps unfortunately, you want to use that language, but they're going to have to line up or die, whatever.
What, you don't think Estonia can take on Russia?
No matter how big their egos of these guys are, it's not enough.
I think that's called the
The forces that
Napoleon
they'll be dealing with.
complex.
Well, if they had a tiddlywinks contest, 2 out of 3, maybe Estonia could pull that off, but I don't think much else.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's a moment ripe with opportunity and therefore also very dangerous. I think there is a kind of, and frankly, the West has become so degenerate, you don't know if some of the things occurring are simply a result of our cultural degeneracy, the drug addiction, the legalization of recreational marijuana at very high potency levels, and the lack of mental health care, where you have all these mass shootings and all kinds of things, which really create a dynamic where people become very fearful, and frankly, fearful of thinking profoundly that things actually can be very, very different. It was very striking on the youth conference that Helga LaRouche just convened with about 130 young people from all over the world, when young representatives of various African nations talk about economy, they are talking about physical production. They are talking about nuclear power. They're talking about petroleum being used for plastics to build intensive care units and things like that. Here, you have such an obsession with money and the markets and people wanting to be YouTube influencers. And President Trump announced this brilliant new program to get children involved in wealth management. So the Dells, this couple, the Dells, are going to bequeath, I think, I forget how many it adds up to, is it 600 billion or whatever it was, I don't remember, 25 million babies born to families that make less than $150,000, something or other. But each one of these babies is going to get $1,000, but it's not $1,000. It's an investment. And so from the time that they're 3 years old, they're going to be brainwashed to be following what is happening with their investment on the markets. I mean, no conception of production, of what is going to be needed for future generations, of building new cities, of high-speed rail, of anything that's inspiring at all. And you're right, we have to change the way we think. And what I find fascinating, I would like our viewers to reflect on, is that young people, for example, in Iraq, which has been under siege and in a war, funded and armed by the United States, if organized by the British and Zionist lobby, but they've been in war for over 30 years. But young people there still have a sense that they are organizing for the future. Their conditions of life are much more difficult than the conditions of life for many American children, even though many American children live in horrible poverty. But it's not like being in a bomb shelter, bombed out place. But they are actually have a sense that they have a plan and intention to move forward. Africa, similarly, the conditions of life, people don't have electricity for 24 hours a day or 4 hours a day, but they say, we're moving forward. We're going to have nuclear power. Colonialism is over. Here, there has been a kind of conditioning that you just have to expect that your life will be harder than your parents', that you're never going to be able to afford a house, you're never going to be able to raise a family. And it's been moving in that direction now since the assassination of Kennedy, in particular, very sharply. And that's become kind of an axiom. And I think that people might reflect for a moment of how quickly that can change. Because it's not that your condition in life is going to change overnight, but your outlook and your approach to what the future is can change in an instant or in the twinkling of an eye, as they say. And that's the shift that has to happen in the US. And I think it may end up happening from the outside coming in. Bill, go ahead. What were you?
I think what you say is absolutely correct, and what what you're doing in your campaigns and what we're doing on the streets is what's the internal action that is changing the situation. But it's in a context where the United States, where other countries are moving forward, and those people in Africa and other countries are not looking now to the United States as the model for what they want to become. They're looking to China and they're looking to Russia, not because they have a predilection for that or anger against the United States specifically. It's because that our economy is falling apart, and whatever the president says about this golden age, nobody sees it. It's a gilded age, right? Because what gilding is a little gold paint, which gives what the dictionary calls a beautiful or delightful or specious character. And that's what it is, right?
They might be confusing gilding with gelding, which is something else not very pleasant, but go ahead.
Right. Well, I think that's what we have here, and there's no substance to it. And I think the president is realizing now that his plan is not working. It's not going to work in any of these fields he's talking about. They're talking all about AI as if their robots will do everything for us. But there's no real investment in science, no real investment in the economy. And you can see what other countries are doing. And at a certain point, there's got to be this wake-up call. We play that role in what we're doing here. But the fact of the reality moving outside of ourselves in a different direction, I think is going to have an effect, big time as people begin to realize that. And hopefully that happens sooner rather than later, given the situation we have in the world today.
Yes, exactly. So I think we have to wrap up. So I'll go first to you, Bill, for any closing thoughts, anything you wish we had said or what you want to say, and then Rich, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, and the time has come a long time ago that NATO should have been dissolved. Even in the 1970s, I know myself as a NATO soldier that there wasn't much we did in those days. I mean, we were waiting for the Russians to come through the Fulda Gap, and of course they never did, and they wouldn't unless they were provoked to do that. So even, at that time, and it's understood that this is pretty much a pro forma operation. And of course, when the wall came down and there was tremendous amount of excitement and there was an agreement that the Russians had of reuniting Germany, I mean, that kind of an excitement should have led to the end of NATO and the reestablishment of what the Russians wanted to do. That is, create this new security architecture of which they would be a part. And it just didn't, for a variety of reasons, but also because of I say the attacks that Lynn was given at that time is probably plays a bigger role in a lot of things than people actually realize, because the president was, he was smart. He could listen to that, but his weakness led him to make foolish decisions, and that we're living with the consequences of that today in a world now which is closer to nuclear war than it had been since the Cuba crisis. And I think we have to take that into consideration and move forward on these issues, getting rid of NATO, talking about new security architecture, and getting rid of this Russian claptrap that you get all the time in the U.S. Congress, and also against the anti-Chinese claptrap, because these countries are now working closer than any two countries have worked in, countries their size. And we should be a part of that. And they would want us to be a part of that. Russia would want us to be a part of that. China would also want us to be a part of that, and we're the ones who are saying no, and we've got to start saying yes to these things. It's the only way we're going to revive our economy as well.
Yes. Rich?
Yeah, I think just one quick thing. I think the address to the nation by Trump revealed the total utter bankruptcy and actual destructiveness of what he's pursuing for the most part. And we've got, you and I have talked about this a few times, Diane, we've got about 40% of the American population that are below the level of existence, and they're being destroyed. And this Heritage Foundation Mount Pelerin society, fascist policy, which the rich think that they can push through, that is going to make it far worse as a financial and so forth collapse comes upon us. An age of crypto and derivatives, which have to be wiped out. But I think the point is to take what both you, Diane, and Bill have been saying. Look, the point when Helge keeps coming back to the point of the Treaty of Westphalia, because people think, why go back so many years? I mean, that's the 40s. The point is, it's the principle. It's the principle of the other. And that is the opposite, that man is a beast, that man is a wolf to man. Now, that takes some thinking. And if we can show people that getting out of NATO is a step, it's not the whole thing. It's obviously got to be that. But the idea is that the world can take this, which changes their thinking, and simultaneously puts together the U.S. with Russia. And I believe also with China, because and I think what's also going to happen with India. And it can happen in space. I think it can also happen in the Bering Strait Tunnel. That is the way I think we're going to change the way that the kids that you were talking about, Diane, are going to think about the world. Once they see a mission and once they see something going, and I just want to say, during the first years of the New Deal, 1933, 34, 35, 36, things were being planned. But the minute people saw something being built, it changed. It might not have been in their own area. You saw something being built in Tennessee or elsewhere, California. It was excitement. It was happening, and you were alive, and you were watching it, and your government was doing it. And that's the dynamic, because it's really dynamics that change things. That's the dynamic which, once it starts to take hold, and we're very close to that, that's how you get some of these cynical or frightened or terrified people who don't see that their life is worth anything. I think that's going to be that, along with whatever we do domestically.
Great. Well, thank you both. And I'd like to thank everybody who has joined us and watched this evening. As I said, this is the last program before Christmas, and I wish that everyone would have a wonderful and reflexive time at Christmas. And during this holiday season, please do not forget the people in Bethlehem today and what is happening in that part of the world. So I'll see everybody next week.